David Martinez pressed his phone against his ear as static crackled through the failing cell towers. The emergency broadcast had been repeating for hours now, warning citizens to stay indoors and avoid contact with infected individuals. Through his apartment window, he could see smoke rising from the downtown area where his daughter Emma attended college. She hadn't answered her phone in 6 hours, and the last text she'd sent simply read, "Dad, something's wrong here. People are acting crazy." David's hands trembled as he packed his emergency kit, stuffing medical supplies, flashlights, and his grandfather's hunting knife into a backpack. His wife Sarah had died 2 years ago from cancer, leaving Emma as the only family he had left. The news report spoke of a viral outbreak that caused extreme aggression and loss of higher brain function, but David didn't care about the technical details. All that mattered was reaching his 20-year-old daughter before it was too late. He checked his service weapon one last time, ensuring it was loaded and ready. As a security guard at the local mall, he'd never had to use it in a real emergency, but today felt different. The screams echoing from the streets below confirmed his worst fears. David grabbed his car keys and headed for the door, pausing only to look at a photo of Emma on his kitchen table. She was smiling in her graduation cap, full of hope for the future. He whispered a prayer and stepped into the chaos-filled hallway of his apartment building. The elevator was out of order, and as he descended the stairwell, he could hear his neighbors arguing about whether to stay or flee. Some doors remained sealed shut, while others hung open, abandoned in haste. On the 3rd floor, David encountered Mrs. Chin, an elderly woman who lived alone. She was sitting on the stairs, crying softly while holding a small dog. "They took my grandson," she whispered as David approached. "He was visiting for the weekend, and when those things came through the lobby he ran. I haven't seen him since." David knelt beside her, fighting the urge to keep moving. "Mrs. Chin, you need to get back to your apartment and lock the door. Don't open it for anyone unless you're absolutely sure it's safe." He helped her to her feet and watched as she shuffled back to her unit. The weight of leaving her behind pressed on his conscience, but Emma's safety had to come first. As he reached the ground floor, David peered through the stairwell window into the lobby. 3 figures stood near the entrance, their movements erratic and unnatural. Their clothes were torn and stained with dark liquid, and they seemed to be sniffing the air like wild animals. David had seen enough news footage to recognize the infected. He gripped his backpack straps tighter and planned his route to the parking garage. The emergency exit led directly to the basement level where his car waited. Moving as quietly as possible, David pushed open the heavy door and slipped into the garage. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows between the concrete pillars. His sedan sat in its usual spot, and he'd never been more grateful for his habit of keeping the gas tank full. As he approached the vehicle, a wet shuffling sound echoed from behind a nearby van. David froze, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. A figure emerged from the shadows, wearing what had once been a business suit. The man's face was pale and streaked with dried blood, his eyes vacant and hungry. This was David's first real encounter with one of the infected, and the reality was far more terrifying than any news report could convey. The creature noticed David and let out a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from deep within its chest. David's training kicked in as he slowly backed toward his car, keeping his movements smooth and deliberate. The infected man began shuffling forward, picking up speed with each step. David reached his vehicle and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking from adrenaline. The car door opened just as the creature reached him, and David dove inside, slamming the door shut. The infected man pounded on the window with surprising strength, leaving bloody handprints on the glass. David started the engine and backed out of the parking space, the creature falling to the ground as the car moved away. As he drove up the exit ramp, David could see more infected wandering the streets outside. Part 2. The city streets resembled a war zone as David navigated through abandoned vehicles and debris. Overturned cars blocked major intersections, forcing him to take increasingly dangerous detours through residential neighborhoods. The radio crackled with fragmented emergency broadcasts, each one more desperate than the last. "All available units respond to Mercy General Hospital," came one transmission. "We have multiple casualties and need immediate assistance." David turned the volume down, unable to bear the sounds of a city falling apart. His GPS had stopped working an hour ago, leaving him to rely on his knowledge of the area to reach the university district. Emma's dormitory was located on the north side of campus, a 20-minute drive under normal circumstances. Today it felt like navigating through a nightmare. As he turned onto Maple Street, David spotted a group of survivors running between houses, carrying backpacks and supplies. One of them, a young woman about Emma's age, stumbled and fell. The others stopped to help her, but their delay proved costly. A pack of infected emerged from an alleyway, drawn by the commotion. David watched in horror as the group scattered, some making it to safety while others were overwhelmed. The young woman who had fallen was surrounded, her screams cutting through the air before being abruptly silenced. David gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing himself to keep driving. Every instinct told him to help, but stopping now would mean abandoning Emma. The weight of these impossible choices pressed down on him as he continued toward the university. Traffic lights no longer functioned, and David had to navigate by landmark and memory. The familiar coffee shop where he'd met Emma for lunch just last week was now a burning shell, its windows shattered and interior gutted. A fire truck sat abandoned in the middle of the street, its crew nowhere to be seen. David maneuvered around it, noting the claw marks scored deep into the vehicle's metal sides. Whatever had attacked the firefighters possessed incredible strength. The university's main entrance came into view, marked by the distinctive brick archway that had welcomed students for over a century. Now it stood like a gateway to hell, with abandoned cars scattered across the campus grounds and dark smoke rising from several buildings. David parked near the visitor center and gathered his supplies. The campus map posted near the entrance showed Emma's dormitory was approximately half a mile away, across the central quad and past the library. The route would take him through the most populated areas of campus, where the concentration of infected was likely to be highest. David checked his weapon one more time and began his journey on foot. The pathways that had once been filled with students hurrying to class were now littered with personal belongings and signs of struggle. Textbooks lay scattered across the ground, their pages fluttering in the wind. A bicycle was overturned near the fountain, its front wheel still spinning slowly. David moved carefully from building to building, using doorways and landscaping for cover. The silence was almost worse than the chaos he'd witnessed in the streets. At least noise indicated life, even if it was dangerous. This eerie quiet suggested something far worse had already passed through. As he approached the student union building, David heard voices coming from inside. He pressed himself against a window and peered through the glass. A group of about 15 students had barricaded themselves in the main lounge, using tables and chairs to block the entrances. They looked exhausted and terrified but alive. For a moment, David considered joining them, but Emma's dormitory was still several blocks away. He couldn't afford to get trapped in a building no matter how secure it appeared. Moving past the student union, David encountered his first group of infected on campus. 4 individuals in university staff uniforms wandered near the administration building, their movements sluggish but persistent. They seemed to be following some kind of scent or sound that David couldn't detect. He crouched behind a maintenance shed and watched their patterns, looking for an opportunity to slip past undetected. The infected moved in rough formations, never straying too far from each other. David realized they were hunting as a pack, which made them far more dangerous than the solitary creature he'd encountered in the parking garage. One of them, wearing a groundskeeper's uniform, suddenly turned in David's direction. Its nose twitched as if catching a scent, and it began shuffling toward the maintenance shed. David's heart pounded as he prepared to run or fight, knowing that either choice would likely attract the attention of the other 3 infected. Part 3. David held his breath as the infected groundskeeper approached his hiding spot behind the maintenance shed. The creature's movements were deliberate but uncoordinated, like a predator following an instinct it didn't fully understand. David could see the man's face clearly now, noting the clouded eyes and the way his jaw hung slack. Whatever humanity had once existed there was gone, replaced by something purely driven by hunger and aggression. The groundskeeper stopped just feet from the shed, tilting his head as if listening for something. David's hand moved slowly to his weapon, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger an attack. The other 3 infected continued their patrol near the administration building, seemingly unaware of their companion's investigation. A sudden crash from across the quad startled all 4 creatures, and they immediately began moving toward the sound. David watched as they shuffled away, their attention completely diverted by the new disturbance. He used the opportunity to move deeper into campus, keeping to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. The crash had come from the direction of the library, where David could now see smoke rising from broken windows. Whatever had happened there was drawing infected from across the campus, creating a dangerous congregation of the creatures. David's route to Emma's dormitory would take him dangerously close to the library, but there was no alternative path that wouldn't add hours to his journey. As he approached the campus bookstore, David noticed movement in the upper windows of the surrounding buildings. Students had barricaded themselves in classrooms and offices, creating makeshift safe rooms throughout the campus. Some waved desperately when they saw him, pleading for help or rescue. David's heart broke each time he had to ignore their pleas, but he knew that stopping to help would only endanger Emma. The hard truth was that he couldn't save everyone, and attempting to do so would likely result in saving no one. A group of infected had gathered near the library's main entrance, drawn by sounds coming from within. David counted at least 12 creatures, far too many to fight or sneak past. He would have to find another route even if it meant doubling back and losing precious time. The campus maintenance tunnels offered a potential alternative, but David wasn't sure he could find the entrance without a detailed map. As he considered his options, a window on the library's second floor exploded outward, raining glass onto the infected below. A figure appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the flames behind them. For a terrifying moment, David thought it might be Emma, but the person was too tall and broad-shouldered to be his daughter. The figure hesitated at the window, looking down at the crowd of infected below. David realized they were trapped, with no way to escape except through the creatures waiting at ground level. The person made their decision and jumped, landing hard on the pavement and immediately scrambling to their feet. The infected swarmed toward the new prey, and David watched in horror as the survivor disappeared beneath the mass of bodies. The feeding frenzy that followed was too gruesome to witness, and David forced himself to look away. He used the distraction to move past the library, keeping to the far side of the quad where the trees provided better cover. Emma's dormitory was now visible in the distance, a 7-story brick building that looked remarkably intact compared to the surrounding structures. Hope flickered in David's chest as he imagined finding his daughter safe in her room, perhaps barricaded with her roommates and waiting for rescue. The building's parking lot was filled with abandoned cars, their doors left open in the panic of evacuation. David moved carefully between the vehicles, checking each one for threats before advancing. As he approached the dormitory's main entrance, he noticed that the glass doors were shattered, and dark stains marked the concrete steps. The lobby beyond was dark and silent, offering no clues about what he might find inside. David paused at the entrance, gathering his courage for what lay ahead. Emma's room was on the 5th floor, and he would have to navigate through potentially dozens of infected to reach her. The elevator was obviously out of service, leaving the stairwell as his only option. David entered the building and immediately noticed the smell, a combination of fear, violence, and something else he couldn't identify. The lobby showed clear signs of struggle, with overturned furniture and personal belongings scattered across the floor. A bulletin board had been torn from the wall, its contents scattered like confetti. David found the stairwell and began his ascent, moving slowly and listening for any sounds that might indicate danger. The second floor was eerily quiet, but David could see scratch marks on the walls and doors that suggested infected had been through this area. Some of the dormitory room doors hung open, revealing empty spaces where students had either fled or been taken. Others remained sealed, possibly hiding survivors who were too afraid to venture out. David continued climbing, his anxiety growing with each floor as he drew closer to Emma's room. Part 4. The stairwell grew darker as David climbed higher, the emergency lighting system having failed sometime during the chaos. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing disturbing evidence of the Outbreak's passage through the dormitory. Bloodstains decorated the walls in abstract patterns, and personal items lay scattered on the landing of each floor. A teddy bear sat abandoned on the 3rd floor, its fur matted with dark liquid. David stepped over it carefully, trying not to think about its young owner. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the distant groaning of the building's structure. As he reached the 4th floor, David heard a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere above. He paused, listening intently and trying to determine if the noise was made by infected or survivors. The scratching continued in irregular patterns, sometimes stopping for several seconds before resuming. David decided to investigate, knowing that Emma's room was just 1 floor away. The 5th floor landing was partially collapsed, with debris blocking the main hallway. David squeezed through a gap in the rubble and found himself in the dormitory corridor where Emma lived. The familiar surroundings seemed surreal in the context of the outbreak. He'd walked this hallway dozens of times during visits, helping Emma move in at the beginning of each semester and taking her to dinner on campus. Room 517 was halfway down the corridor, its door marked by a small whiteboard where Emma and her roommate Jessica had written encouraging messages to each other. David approached the door and knocked softly, using a pattern he and Emma had established when she was a child. 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones. The corridor remained silent, and David felt his heart sinking. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which immediately raised his concern. Emma was always careful about security, especially after the campus safety seminars she'd attended. David pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight revealing an empty dormitory room. The beds were unmade and personal belongings were scattered across the floor as if someone had packed in a hurry. Emma's laptop sat open on her desk, its screen dark and lifeless. David moved to her closet and noticed that several outfits were missing, along with her hiking boots and winter jacket. A small suitcase was gone from under her bed, suggesting that Emma had at least had time to gather some essentials before leaving. David felt a mixture of relief and worry. His daughter wasn't here, but she might have escaped safely. He searched through her remaining belongings, looking for any clue about where she might have gone. Hidden under her pillow, David found a note written in Emma's handwriting. "Dad, if you're reading this, I'm okay. Jessica and I are going to the emergency shelter at the community center on Oak Street. The campus isn't safe anymore. Please find us there. I love you." The note was dated 2 days ago, which meant Emma had been gone for at least 48 hours. David folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket, feeling a surge of renewed hope. His daughter was alive and thinking clearly enough to leave him a message. The community center was about 2 miles from campus, but David was confident he could reach it before dark. As he prepared to leave the dormitory room, David heard the scratching sound again, much closer this time. It seemed to be coming from the room next door where Emma's friend Katie lived. David approached the adjacent door and listened carefully. The scratching was definitely coming from inside the room, accompanied by what sounded like muffled whimpering. David tried the door handle and found it locked, but the sounds continued. He knocked softly and called out, "Hello? Is someone in there?" The scratching stopped immediately, followed by complete silence. David waited several minutes before trying again, but there was no response. He considered forcing the door open, but the silence suggested that whatever was inside might be dangerous. Instead, he decided to focus on reaching Emma at the community center. As David made his way back to the stairwell, he heard footsteps echoing from the floors below. Multiple sets of feet were moving up the stairs, their rhythm uneven and shuffling. David realized that infected had entered the building and were making their way toward his location. He had to find an alternative route to the ground floor, or risk being trapped in the upper levels of the dormitory. The fire escape was his best option, but it would require him to break a window and potentially alert every infected in the area to his presence. David moved quickly to the end of the corridor, where a large window overlooked the campus quad. He could see the fire escape ladder just outside, its metal rungs leading down to the building's first floor. The window was painted shut, but David managed to force it open with his knife. The cool air rushed into the stuffy corridor, carrying with it the sounds of chaos from across campus. David climbed onto the fire escape and began his descent, trying to move as quietly as possible on the metal structure. Halfway down, he heard a window breaking somewhere above him, followed by the distinctive moan of an infected creature. David quickened his pace, knowing that he was now being pursued. The fire escape ended at a small landing above the building's basement level, requiring David to drop the final 8 feet to the ground. He landed hard but managed to roll with the impact, avoiding serious injury. As he regained his footing, David could hear infected moving through the building above him, their sounds echoing through the broken windows. Part 5. David sprinted away from the dormitory as infected began appearing at the broken windows above, their moans echoing across the campus quad. The community center on Oak Street was his next destination, but getting there meant crossing the most dangerous part of the city. The route would take him through the downtown area where the outbreak had first begun, and where the concentration of infected was likely to be highest. David moved through the residential neighborhoods surrounding the university, keeping to backyards and side streets where possible. The houses told their own stories of the outbreak's progression. Some stood empty with doors hanging open, while others were barricaded with furniture and plywood. Occasionally, David spotted faces peering out from upper-story windows, survivors who had chosen to shelter in place rather than venture into the chaos outside. A few tried to get his attention, gesturing for help or supplies, but David couldn't afford to stop. Every minute that passed increased the chances that Emma might be forced to leave the community center shelter. As he reached the edge of the residential area, David encountered a military checkpoint that had been hastily abandoned. Concrete barriers and razor wire created a defensive perimeter, but the soldiers who had manned it were nowhere to be seen. Spent ammunition casings littered the ground, and David could see bullet holes in the surrounding buildings. Whatever had happened here had overwhelmed even trained military personnel. An abandoned armored vehicle sat in the middle of the street, its rear doors hanging open and its cargo area empty. David approached cautiously, hoping to find additional weapons or supplies, but the vehicle had been thoroughly looted. As he searched through the checkpoint, David found a military radio that was still functional. He tuned it to emergency frequencies and listened to the fragmented communications between various rescue teams. Eagle Base, this is Rescue Team 7. We've lost contact with the hospital evacuation. Repeat, Mercy General is overrun. The voices were strained and professional, but David could hear the underlying panic. All units, be advised that the infection appears to be spreading faster than initially projected. Current estimates suggest 60% of the metropolitan area is now affected. David turned off the radio, unable to bear any more bad news. He had to focus on reaching Emma, not on the larger catastrophe unfolding around them. The downtown area lay ahead, its familiar skyline now marked by columns of smoke and the occasional flash of emergency lights. David could see that many of the high-rise buildings had gone dark, their windows either shattered or boarded up. The streets that had once been filled with commuters and shoppers were now hunting grounds for the infected. David moved from building to building, using doorways and overturned vehicles for cover. The infected seemed to be more numerous in the downtown area, but they also appeared to be less coordinated. Instead of the pack behavior he'd observed on campus, these creatures wandered individually or in small groups, following no apparent pattern. David realized that the longer someone had been infected, the more their cognitive function deteriorated. The fresher infected retained some problem-solving abilities, while those who had been transformed for days were little more than mindless predators. This knowledge helped David predict their movements and avoid confrontation. As he approached the Oak Street Bridge that led to the community center, David encountered the largest group of infected he'd seen yet. At least 30 creatures had gathered in the intersection, apparently drawn by sounds coming from a nearby apartment building. David could hear screaming and gunfire from the upper floors, suggesting that survivors were making a desperate stand. The infected were completely focused on the building, clawing at the walls and trying to find a way inside. David realized this was his opportunity to cross the intersection undetected. He moved along the far side of the street, keeping low and using parked cars for cover. The infected were so focused on the apartment building that they didn't notice him passing just 50 feet away. As David reached the other side of the intersection, the gunfire from the apartment building suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more chilling than the violence had been. David forced himself to keep moving, knowing that he couldn't help the people in the building and that stopping would only add to the casualties. The community center was now visible across the bridge, its red brick facade and familiar architecture offering a beacon of hope. David could see people moving around the building's perimeter, and what appeared to be guards stationed at the entrances. The sight of organized human activity filled him with relief and anticipation. Emma was there, waiting for him, and their reunion was now just minutes away. The bridge crossing proved to be the most dangerous part of David's journey yet. The span was littered with abandoned vehicles, creating a maze of potential hiding spots for infected. David moved carefully between the cars, checking each one before advancing. Halfway across the bridge, he discovered that several of the vehicles still contained their occupants, families who had been caught in traffic when the outbreak began. The scenes inside the cars were heartbreaking, and David struggled to maintain his composure as he continued toward the community center. As he approached the far end of the bridge, David could see the community center's main entrance clearly. A group of armed civilians stood guard outside, checking identification and screening people before allowing them entry. David felt a surge of hope as he realized that Emma might indeed be safe behind those walls, protected by organized survivors who had managed to create a secure haven in the midst of chaos. Part 6. David reached the community center's perimeter as the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the streets. The building was surrounded by a makeshift fence constructed from shopping carts, furniture, and anything else the survivors could find. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons ranging from hunting rifles to kitchen knives. Despite the improvised nature of their defenses, David was impressed by the organization and discipline displayed by the survivors. A man in his 50s approached David as he neared the main entrance, a shotgun held casually but ready. "Hold up there, friend," the man called out. "I'm Tom Bradley, security chief for this shelter. I need to check you for bites or scratches before you can enter." David submitted to the inspection, understanding the necessity of the precaution. Tom examined his arms, neck and any exposed skin for signs of infection. "You look clean," Tom announced. But you'll need to wait in quarantine for 24 hours before we can let you into the main population. That's standard procedure. David's heart sank at the mention of quarantine, but he knew arguing would be pointless. I'm looking for my daughter, he explained. Emma Martinez. She left me a note saying she would be here. Tom's expression softened slightly. Emma's here and she's safe. She's been asking about you for 2 days straight. I can let her know you've arrived, but the quarantine rule applies to everyone. We can't risk the infection spreading inside the shelter. David nodded, understanding the logic even as his heart ached to see Emma immediately. Tom led him to a small room that had been converted into a quarantine area. The space was clean and well-maintained, with a cot, basic supplies, and a small window that looked out onto the shelter's main area. Your daughter will be able to see you through the window, Tom explained, and will bring you regular meals and updates. The 24 hours will pass quickly. David settled into the quarantine room and waited. Within minutes, he heard footsteps running down the corridor outside. Emma's voice called out, "Dad. Dad, is that really you?" David pressed his face to the window and saw his daughter on the other side of the glass. She looked thin and tired but wonderfully alive. Tears streamed down both their faces as they pressed their hands against opposite sides of the window. "I knew you'd come," Emma whispered. "I never doubted it for a second." They spent the next several hours talking through the glass, sharing their experiences from the past few days. Emma described the chaos that had erupted on campus, how she and her roommate Jessica had managed to escape before the situation became completely hopeless. The infection spread so fast, Emma explained. 1 minute everything was normal, and the next minute people were attacking each other in the hallways. Jessica and I grabbed what we could and ran. David told Emma about his journey through the city, carefully omitting the most disturbing details. He focused on the positive aspects, the survivors he'd seen, the signs of organization and resistance among the human population. Emma listened intently, occasionally asking questions about specific locations or people she knew. As evening approached, Tom Bradley returned to check on David. "Your daughter's been one of our most valuable volunteers," he reported. "She's been helping with the medical station and organizing supplies. Smart girl you raised there." David felt a surge of pride, though he wasn't surprised by Emma's resourcefulness. She had always been mature for her age, taking on responsibilities after her mother's death and excelling in her studies despite the emotional challenges. "What's the long-term plan for the shelter?" David asked. Tom's expression grew serious. "We're in contact with other survivor groups across the region. There's talk of establishing a permanent settlement outside the city, somewhere the infection hasn't reached. But that's still in the planning stages." David nodded, understanding the complexity of such an undertaking. Moving hundreds of survivors across infected territory would be extremely dangerous, requiring careful planning and significant resources. As night fell, David tried to sleep on the quarantine room's narrow cot. The sounds of the shelter continued around him, guards changing shifts, people moving through the corridors, and the occasional discussion about supplies or security. Despite the circumstances, David felt more hopeful than he had since the outbreak began. Emma was safe, they were together, and they had found a community of survivors who were working together to build something better. The quarantine period would end in the morning, and then David could finally hold his daughter in his arms again. He had traveled through hell to reach her, but the journey had been worth every dangerous moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight David allowed himself to feel grateful for the miracle of their reunion. Outside his window, David could see Emma sitting in the main area, reading a book by lamplight. She looked up occasionally and waved, and David waved back, counting down the hours until their 24-hour separation would finally end. The community center had become their sanctuary, a place where they could begin to rebuild their lives and plan for whatever future awaited them in this transformed world. Part 7. Dawn broke over the community center as David completed his 24-hour quarantine period. Tom Bradley arrived with a cup of coffee and a smile, unlocking the door to the quarantine room. "Welcome to our little community," he said, extending his hand. "Your daughter's been pacing the halls for the past hour, waiting for this moment." David stepped out of the quarantine room and immediately found himself wrapped in Emma's embrace. They held each other tightly, both crying with relief and joy. The reunion David had desperately hoped for during his journey through the infected city was finally happening. Emma felt real and solid in his arms, proof that his dangerous journey had been worthwhile. "I was so scared I'd lost you," Emma whispered against his shoulder. "When the campus went crazy, all I could think about was getting to safety so you could find me." David pulled back to look at his daughter's face, noting the maturity that had developed in just a few days. The outbreak had forced everyone to grow up quickly, but Emma seemed to have handled the transition better than most. "Show me around," David said. "I want to see what you've built here." Emma led him through the community center, proudly displaying the various areas that had been converted for survival. The gymnasium had become a dormitory, with family areas separated by hanging blankets for privacy. The kitchen was operating around the clock, preparing meals from canned goods and supplies gathered from abandoned stores. A medical station had been established in what used to be the children's playroom, staffed by a retired nurse and a veterinarian who had adapted his skills to treat human patients. "We have about 200 people here," Emma explained. "Families, college students, elderly folks, people from all walks of life. Everyone contributes something to the community." David was impressed by the organization and the positive attitude of the survivors. Despite the horror outside their walls, the people in the shelter had created something resembling normal life. Children played games in designated areas while adults worked on various tasks needed to maintain the community. "The hardest part is making decisions about who to let in," Emma continued. "Every day people arrive asking for shelter, but we have limited resources and space. Tom and the council have to make difficult choices about who can stay and who has to be turned away." David understood the moral complexity of their situation. Saving everyone wasn't possible, but deciding who deserved help and who didn't was an impossible burden. Tom Bradley joined them as they completed their tour of the facility. "David, we could use someone with your security experience," he said. "I know you're probably tired from your journey, but we're always short-handed on guard duty." David nodded, eager to contribute to the community that had kept his daughter safe. "I'd be happy to help with security. What are the main threats you're dealing with?" Tom's expression grew serious. "The infected are the obvious problem, but we also have to worry about desperate humans. Some survivor groups have turned to raiding other communities for supplies. We've had to fight off 3 separate attacks in the past week." David felt a chill as he realized that the breakdown of society had created multiple layers of danger. The infected were a constant threat, but human desperation and greed posed equally serious challenges. "There's something else," Tom continued. "We've been monitoring radio communications from other survivor groups. There are rumors of a safe zone being established by the military, somewhere up north. But the reports are inconsistent, and we don't know if it's real or just wishful thinking." Emma looked at her father with concern. "Some people want to leave the shelter and try to reach the safe zone. Others think we should stay here and continue building our community. The council has been debating the issue for days." David considered the dilemma. Staying at the community center offered the security of known defenses and established resources, but it also meant remaining in an infected area with limited long-term prospects. Attempting to reach a military safe zone would be extremely dangerous, but it might offer the possibility of a truly secure future. "What do you think we should do?" David asked Emma. "I think we should stay here," she replied without hesitation. "This community has worked hard to build something good. Abandoning it based on unconfirmed rumors seems like a mistake." David felt proud of his daughter's thoughtful analysis. She had learned to think strategically about survival, weighing risks and benefits carefully. That evening, David attended his first community meeting in the shelter's main assembly area. The debate about whether to stay or attempt to reach the rumored safe zone was heated but civil. Various speakers presented their arguments, with families torn between the desire for security and the hope for a better future. "We know what we have here," argued an elderly man named Frank. "We've created something stable and safe. Why risk everything on a rumor?" A young mother named Sarah disagreed. "My children deserve a chance at a real future, not just survival. If there's a safe zone where they can go to school and live normal lives, we have to try." David listened to the debate with growing understanding of the complexity of their situation. There were no easy answers and every choice carried significant risks. As the meeting continued, David realized that whatever decision the community made, he and Emma would face it together. Their reunion had given him something precious to protect, and he would do whatever it took to ensure their survival in this dangerous new world. Part 8. The community meeting extended well into the night as survivors wrestled with the most important decision they'd faced since the outbreak began. David found himself drawn into the debate, his perspective as a newcomer offering a unique view of the situation. "I've seen what's out there," he told the assembled group. "The infected are everywhere, but they're not the only danger. The city is collapsing and resources are becoming scarce. Whatever we decide, we need to act quickly." Tom Bradley presented the latest intelligence they'd gathered about the rumored safe zone. We've made contact with a group that claims to have reached a military installation about 200 miles north. They report organized defenses, medical facilities, and plans for long-term reconstruction. But the journey would be incredibly dangerous, and we have no guarantee the safe zone actually exists. Emma stood to address the community, her voice steady despite her youth. I've been thinking about what my mother would want for us, she said. She always taught me that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who care for each other and work together. This community has become our family, and families stick together. Her words resonated with many in the room, and David felt a surge of pride at his daughter's wisdom. The debate continued for another hour before Tom called for a preliminary vote. The results were close. 53% voted to stay at the community center, while 47% wanted to attempt the journey to the safe zone. We won't make a final decision tonight, Tom announced. Let's all think about what we've heard and meet again tomorrow evening. This choice will affect everyone, so we need to be sure we're making the right one. As the meeting dispersed, David and Emma walked to their assigned sleeping area in the gymnasium. The space was cramped but comfortable, with a small area sectioned off by hanging blankets. Emma had personalized their space with a few photos and personal items she'd managed to save,